We are pleased to have Joseph Atwill and Ryan Gilmore join us at Time Monk Radio for a conversation on Christianity, psychological warfare, and consciousness. Joseph is the author of The Caesar's Messiah, the Roman Conspiracy to Invent Jesus. The Flavian signature edition of Caesar's Messiah adds the most detailed presentation of the parallels discovered between the works of Josephus and the Book of Luke. You can learn more about Joseph's compelling research, including his upcoming book, The Single Strand, at caesarsmessiah.com. Ryan Gilmore is the organizer behind the unique symposium, The Covert Messiah, Is Christianity the Genesis of Modern Psychological Warfare? You can learn more about Ryan at covertmessiah.com. Hi, Joe and Ryan. Welcome to Time Monk Radio.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Joseph, can you give us a bit of background on your thesis and the impetus for researching the New Testament as well as the Christ myth?
Well, I developed a fascination with basically with the Jesus character very early in my life because I grew up in Japan and went to a Jesuit academy. It was the only English-speaking school nearby, and so I was just trained in the Gospels relentlessly in my youth. And later on, I was no longer a practicing Catholic, but I still was curious about the history of the religion, and I was interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were interesting to me because they describe a messianic movement. There was a Christ figure, there were disciples, there were the same kind of prophecies that you see in the New Testament. But that organization was militaristic. It was completely different than the organization that is described in the Gospels. The Dead Sea Scrolls describe a xenophobic warrior religious cult. And so I could make no sense of this. I couldn't really try to put the two organizations together at the same point in history in the same area. And so I started studying the Gospels again, trying to see basically why this militaristic organization wasn't reflected in the material that Christianity uses for its history. And in doing that, I started to look at the actual stories of Jesus, and I was at the same time studying the works of Josephus, because in order to understand the first century from an informed position, the first century in Judea, you have to read Josephus because he's really the only historian we have that describes the era. And so in reading the histories of Josephus, I noticed that there were odd parallels between the history that Josephus wrote concerning the Jewish war with Rome, which took place between 66 and 73 CE, and the ministry of Jesus. I started to see that there were a kind of a relationship between events in the war and then the stories that were written about the ministry of Jesus. And one day I realized that all of these parallels that I was seeing, these connections, were occurring in the same sequence. And so this inspired me to research it further, and I realized eventually that the entire ministry of Jesus had been created as what can be called a prefiguration of the military campaign of a Roman Caesar named Titus Flavius.
That had to be quite a moment for you through that research when you discovered that, and then to take it publicly. How has your work been received in your research?
Well, depends who you ask. I would say that it's shocking and has a very emotional effect on Christians. A lot of New Testament scholars, particularly those that have vested interests in other sort of theories of the origins of Christianity, are also alarmed by it and opposed to it. But I think a pretty fair way to kind of see how the public views it is by the hundreds of reviews of the book that have been written in Amazon and Barnes and Noble and other places. And there you'll see that, gee whiz, well over 80% not only think it's plausible, but actually are convinced. I know it sounds odd, but really my understanding of the Gospels is the simplest one that's ever been presented. You just have a very natural reading of the text, and it doesn't require any sort of real deep understanding of the literature. An ordinary reader can simply go through the Gospels if you know what to look for, and you can see that the story of Jesus is fiction, and that it was created by a particular group of Roman Caesars. And you can have a much clearer understanding of the history of Western civilization as a result of this insight.
And I do want to go back to that later in the interview. And if you don't mind, Ryan, how did you become involved in this, and where is your interest?
Well, I heard Joe speak on Jan Irvin's Gnostic Media podcast. And when I first heard Joe speak about the New Testament, I thought he was completely mad, and because it was just so odd and strange and disorienting.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I ended up just coming back to it a few times, and slowly it started to make more sense. And what Joe was saying about his work being the simplest, that is usually the sign of truth. If something has the least amount of assumptions and it has explanatory power, that usually tends to be the truth. So the more I thought about his theory, the more I could see that it had those features. And I said, maybe Joe was really onto something. So I started also reading Joe's blog, and Joe put up one post that just puzzled me. So I ended up writing Joe. That led to him writing back and us talking over Skype. We became fast friends. And so once I became very convinced by Joe's thesis, I just started to ask him, I'd like to be your student and know how I can just help you spread this around. So that's just in the past year or so. That's what I've been trying to help Joe do.
And I saw that you had a conference where you had Joe and another speaker there. And do you intend to have any more of those?
We've been talking about it. So yeah, we had a conference in London on October 19th, 2013. And had quite a good turnout, over 200 people. So yeah, we've been talking about a few more, but nothing, no set plans as of yet.
Okay. And Joe, going back to the process of the typology and how the Romans used to create it, can you go into that a little bit more?
Sure. The character Jesus Christ is the most highly prefigured character in literature. And by that, I mean, it is well understood by all scholars that when the authors of the Gospels created their character Jesus Christ, they used elements from the Old Testament in the construction. So you get just a whole bunch of events that occur in Jesus's ministry, which are based on stories in the Old Testament. And this is a very common technique in Hebraic literature. Often prophets that exist in different points in time have strangely parallel events which show that God has a kind of divine pattern that repeats itself. And in this way, the reader can see that God has essentially designated his prophets by this parallelism. And so with the character Jesus Christ, they used all of these stories in the Old Testament to make the character of Jesus Christ. Everyone knows this, and there are different explanations for it, but everyone is aware that Jesus has been heavily prefigured. But what was missed is that the authors then use Jesus to prefigure the individual that Jesus predicts called the Son of Man. One of the big problems in the gospel, one that's almost never mentioned, either in scholarship or by Christians, is that Jesus predicts that this individual he refers to with a messianic title, the Son of Man, is going to come. And during that time, there will be what is regarded as an apocalypse, that there'll be all of these terrible things that'll take place. Now, Jesus is very specific as to when the individual will come. He basically says he's going to come before 40 years are up. He says that the individual will come before the generation he's talking to passes away. So the problem that Christianity has is that Jesus didn't show up. for his second coming. The events that he's describing are specifically events that occurred during the Roman-Jewish War. And I'm talking about the destruction of the Galilean towns, Jerusalem being encircled with a wall, the razing of the temple complex, the abomination of desolation, etc. These are events that only could have occurred during the Roman war. They are specific events. They occurred during this war, and there is no record, of course, of Jesus Christ having come back during that period. So this is a huge problem for Christianity. But what has simply been overlooked is that the same prefiguration logic that the authors used in the construction of the character Jesus Christ, they also used again to use the character Jesus Christ to prefigure the Son of Man. And by that, I mean the events from Jesus's ministry are very parallel to these events that occurred during the war, the military campaign of this Caesar whose name is Titus Flavius. So Jesus begins, for example, at the Sea of Galilee. He calls his disciples together and he says, if you follow me, you'll become fishers of men. Titus Flavius begins his military campaign at the same location. Location is one of the components of the typological sequence. So it starts at the same point in the in location. It's at the beginning of the ministry. He gathers his troops together. He has a big speech where he says, don't be afraid, follow me. And then he leads them in battle against the Messianic movement of Jews that has rebelled from Rome. They are on the Sea of Galilee in boats. The Romans sink the boats, and then they catch the swimming Jews like fish. So that event has an odd parallelism, and it probably would just, you could dismiss it as simply circumstance, except for the fact that, and then as you move forward in Jesus's ministry, the events continue in their parallelism, and they are in the same sequence. So in other words, when you go through the events, you come to the point where Jesus predicts that the Jerusalem will be encircled with a wall. And then if you're following in the ministry, or excuse me, the history of the war, at that exact time, Titus will say, let's encircle Jerusalem with a wall, and they do so. So in other words, the literal prophecies that Jesus makes and also his activity are all reflected in the war. And this was just a way that Rome could show that the Messianic prophecies, which had been the primary cause of the rebellion, the Messianic prophecies had been really the thing that had spurred the Jews to rebel, that those prophecies were not about a Jew or not about a Jewish Messiah, but they were about a Roman Caesar. Now, this is a bizarre notion, but it is in fact it's exactly what the historian Flavius Josephus says, and it is exactly what all of the Flavian court historians say. They all say that the Jewish Messianic prophecies were seen by the Jews as to predict a Jewish Messiah, but they were wrong. These prophecies foresaw the Flavian Caesar Titus Flavius. Now, this is a completely perfect alignment with the political perspective of the Gospels, because Jesus Christ says the Son of Man is going to come and all of these terrible things will occur. So you can see that the literature has been unified. They have a prophetic section where Jesus says the Christ, the Son of Man, is going to come and do all these things. And then they have this historian who then records exactly all these things occurs. And so you have this miraculous connection between the prophecies of the Messianic Jews and the Roman Caesar.
Joe, it's Jerry here. I was just wondering what you would say to Christian believers that would argue that the parallel myths are proof of Jesus's divinity.
Well, this is, of course, one of the very first things that come up, and it's been a position that many church theologians have held. Eusebius and St. Augustine both said exactly the same thing. They said what Jesus predicted miraculously came to pass during the Roman war. This, in fact, was, believe it or not, was the basic theological understanding of the religion that Christianity held for the first 1900 years. It was called preterism, and it was the most common understanding of the Gospels right up until what's called critical Christian thinking began in like the 20th century. But the problem with that is that it has no explanation for the Son of Man, because the Son of Man that Jesus predicts is supposed to be there during the war. And unfortunately for the believers in Jesus as a divine person, he doesn't return. And so this is what I would say to them is that, any sort of normal understanding of the literature that's in front of us shows that the prophecies that Jesus is making is specifically about the Roman Caesar. It is not about him. These events take place during the Roman Caesar's military campaign. And this individual, Titus Flavius, is actually claims to be the Jewish Christ. So I would just say that that isn't a coherent understanding of the text. That the Roman Caesars are very vain. They wanted legacy. You drive around Rome, you travel around Asia Minor, and you can see nothing but ruins of monuments to their divinity. They wanted to be seen as human gods. And so the Gospels are simply a manifestation of that vanity. And the Son of Man can easily be understood as Titus Flavius, but cannot be understood rationally as Jesus Christ.
Joe, this is Ryan. A lot of people ask about the motivation. I think, well, why would the Romans want to do this? And this theory does fit really well into Roman history, because how they tended to spread the imperial cult, which worshipped the head of state as a god, is they put a statue of the Caesar in the temple. It's basically saying to other religions, well, you can worship how you want as long as you put a statue of the Caesar in your temple and you worship him as a god, that's fine. But the Jews, they were more bookish, and they didn't want statues in their temples. So to try and do a sort of literary version of a statue of the Caesar, if we buy Joe's theory, that makes a lot of sense. That's the motivation for doing this.
Okay, and Joe and or Ryan, how did the Dead Sea Scrolls lend credibility to your research?
Well, primarily because they show a messianic movement that's militaristic and xenophobic. If you look at the Hebrew Bible, and you actually look at the prophecies that Jesus, the authors of the Gospels, are ascribing to Jesus Christ, you'll see that they all are related to a warrior Messiah. The original Messiah is David. Now, this individual is not telling his followers to turn the other cheek and to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, right? He is a warrior, and he is xenophobic. He is cutting the heads off of people who are, inside the realm of Israel. So the character Jesus Christ is really unhistorical, sort of just from the perspective of the literature that the Messiah comes from. And the Dead Sea Scrolls show that at that point in history, the followers of the Messiah were militaristic. This literature cannot be what spawned the Roman Christian cult. This literature, the Dead Sea Scrolls, is apocalyptic and genocidal toward the Gentiles. It is not compromising in any way. And it's really when I started reading it, it looked very logical. The literature looked really logical, like it stemmed very naturally from the Hebrew Bible. This is what you'd expect in a period of time when Judea was occupied by a foreign army, and that was desecrating their temple. I mean, you would expect that there would be a rebellion that would have the religion as its inspiration. And the Dead Sea Scrolls simply confirm this. It is also the case that the military movement that drove Rome out, which was messianic, in other words, it was that definitely had these prophecies within it, and it was the national movement. It was the power that actually was able to drive Rome out of Judea. And this was extraordinary because at this point in time, Rome was a prison of nations. They had dozens of ethnicities and countries under lock and key, essentially, and they couldn't just permit someone to kick them out and to set up a government right in the middle of the Roman Empire, because this would simply be a signal to all of the imprisoned ethnicities to rebel. So this force was very, very powerful, and it was the national movement. And therefore, this casts doubt on the historicity of the Roman Christian movement. It doesn't have any recording of its existence whatsoever during this time. The first time we really learn about Roman Christianity, it's in Rome, and its members are the family of the Flavian Caesar. So the combination of the Dead Sea Scrolls showing the real warrior-like nature of the Messiah religion and the actual history that the Roman Catholic Church gives, which indicates that the imperial family were the first members, I mean, that really gives you a clear understanding. This is something that isn't taught in catechism class, but it is simply the truth, and everyone can simply go and look at it. The Dead Sea Scrolls describe a warrior Messiah, and the first Roman Catholics are Flavians. They are members of the imperial family, and frankly, I just think this gives a normal person an obvious understanding of who created the religion and why.
Hey, Joe, it's Jerry again. I was just wondering what your views were on the Essenes. Do you think they were part of the warlike tradition, or do you think they were more of a peaceful branch?
But Josephus fortunately gives us the answer to that question. He recorded that one of the captains of the rebels was an Essene. So though they are seen as peaceful, they're certainly hermit-like, they were participants in the Messianic War against Rome.
And I think there's, would the Sicarii have been somehow related to the Essenes?
It's just all of these terms basically I think are relating to the same thing. The Sicarii just refers to the knife that people would hide inside their vestments, and then attack people with. These are, words which zealots, Sicarii, these are all words that describe, in my opinion, people who would have participated in the Messianic rebellion. I mean, basically, if you look at these situations historically, they're always just dialectic. In other words, you've got two sides and you're either on one or the other. It's sort of like the Civil War. I mean, there's nuances within the Confederacy, but the best way to understand them is fighting against the North. And here, the same thing is true. All of the different ways that the religious Jews are described, frankly, are irrelevant. The important thing is that if they were fighting against Rome or not, and all of these groups, the Sicarii, the Essene, the Zealots, they're all fighting against Rome.
Okay. Thanks, Joe.
Joe, has your research or study of the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed instances of typology where the Old Testament is concerned?
Oh, sure. In fact, it's it's very important to understand sort of how the Old Testament typology works and how the Gospels writers developed it. And in the beginning of Caesar's Messiah, I show that in the Old Testament, you have the story of Joseph goes to Egypt, and this is followed in sequence by the Pharaoh massacre of the boys. Exodus 4, you have a statement, all the men are dead who sought thy life. And then you have the return from Egypt to Israel, which features the passing through water, the baptism of the Israelites. Then you go into the wilderness for 40 years where you have the temptations, the temptation by bread, the statement, do not tempt God, and then the commandments to the Israelites to worship only God. Well, that sequence of events from the Old Testament was then used by the authors of Matthew. Because if you look at the concepts that the storyline of the pre-ministry of Jesus goes through, what you see is Joseph goes to Egypt. Herod massacres the boys, just like Pharaoh does. You actually have a verbatim quote to Matthew 2:20 where they say, they are dead who sought the young child's life. Then you have the return from Egypt to Israel. Now you have the baptism. And now Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days. Not 40 years, but 40 days. See, it's typology. There's parallelisms, but it's not verbatimism. It's not exactly the same. And then in the wilderness, you do have, just to clarify what the authors are trying to communicate, you have the three quotations that are made in the about temptations in Exodus, and Jesus simply gives them verbatim. He says, do not tempted by bread, do not tempt God, worship only God. So the whole pre-ministry of Jesus, if you compare it to the Old Testament, is in fact fiction, right? These aren't real stories about Jesus. They're developed from the Old Testament. And what I write in Caesar's Messiah is that this little sequence is a primer. It is the authors communicating to us, telling us that this is the genre of literature that you have stumbled into here. This is the genre. It's prefiguration typology. And the very next story after Jesus exits the wilderness is in Matthew is the fishing for men, where he asks tells his disciples that he predicts that if they follow him, that they will become fishers for men.
And all Joe is saying is that it's the same genre that continues. Most others in biblical scholarship are saying that it switches genres at that point. But Joe is just saying, no, this is the primer. It changes. The typology changes to a different book, but it's the same kind of literature.
Yeah, I mean, it's already changed from Genesis to Exodus, and now it just changes to Josephus's history. But the genre that the authors of Matthew are engaged in is prefiguration typology, and this links right to the Son of Man character Jesus predicts. And I mean, it's so amazing to me that what I have seen and shown hasn't been seen before, because it is simply so obvious. You have a character, Jesus, that has been prefigured in the way that I just showed, how all of these events are coming from the Old Testament. Well, he predicts someone's going to come in the future. So it's very natural that his activity would be a prefigurement of the one who comes after him. In fact, it would be illogical for his life to not prefigure the Son of Man, given the fact that prefiguration is such a strong element in Hebraic literature, and this particular character, Jesus Christ, is prefigured to a ludicrous degree. I mean, he is literally just a zany collection of dozens of these prefigurations. And so, as I said, that it just is shocking that this hasn't been seen, because it's obvious and it's so logical.
Hi, Joe. This is Kevin. I'm just hoping you'd focus on Josephus a little bit. He seems to be a pivotal character in all of this.
Well, I mean, he is, his history is that he was a Jewish priest who was a leader of the rebellion against Rome. He is captured by the Flavians, and while he's captured, he has a vision from God, very convenient, who tells him that the old covenant is dead, and that henceforth the Romans shall have the favor of God. Now, this event is in fact what is being recorded is what's called the New Covenant. I mean, there is literally in Josephus an actual description of the end of the Old Covenant and the beginning of the New Covenant. Now, during the war, Josephus then becomes an aide to the Roman general Titus Flavius. He helps him with the siege of Jerusalem. Following the war, the Flavian family adopts him. He becomes Flavius Josephus. They give him a townhouse in the imperial palace, and he then writes the official history of the war, which has always been linked directly to the origins of Christianity. In fact, without Josephus's history, we wouldn't even know, things like the areas in which Jesus is walking around in. I mean, he's that definitive as far as he's the individual who gives us all the understanding of the era and of the war and of the period of time that Jesus lived in. To give you an example of just how completely wired Josephus is into the Gospels, in the Gospels you have the story of the crucifixion. In that story, you have Jesus being crucified in a group of three. Someone named Joseph Arimathea comes to the Roman commander and he begs him to take Jesus down from the cross, and Jesus miraculously survived. Now, if you are following along in the Roman war story, you'll come to that point where the crucifixion is. And at that point in the Gospels, and at that point you have a crucifixion that Josephus describes. And in this case, you have a group of three being crucified. Josephus begs the Roman commander to take them down from the cross. One of them miraculously survives. Okay, so this is typology. In other words, this is the basis for the story of Jesus' crucifixion. You have the group of three, you have the guy named Joseph, they beg the Roman commander, and then amazingly, because crucifixion is a death sentence, you have one of the three survive. So that's very, very parallel. But here's how intently Josephus is wired into the Gospels. The character who begs the Roman commander to take them down from the cross in the Gospels is Joseph of Arimathea. Josephus's last name is Bar Matthias. And if you compare the two expressions side by side, Arimathea and Bar Matthias in Greek, you'll see they're virtually the same. There's only a two letters difference. And so this character, Joseph, then was based upon the activity of Josephus. So this is the how integral this individual is into the Gospels. And if you really want to understand the Gospels, in my opinion, you have to start by studying his work and that individual.
Thank you. Joe, what entity or entities have replaced Romans throughout history and continue to perpetuate the psychological control and warfare that was started so long ago?
Well, Constantine used Christianity as the mind control device for the feudal system. If you look at how the feudal system was established, it begins with Constantine's what's called his edicts against the coloni. The coloni were a class of Roman citizen that could own land that had been wild, and they had essentially colonized it. That's where the term comes from. And they had made it into productive farmland in which they could own the product of the land that they had colonized. So they were the coloni. Well, Constantine ended that. He said, no, you couldn't own your land. The state would own the land. You couldn't leave the land you were born on. You had to stay put. You couldn't change vocation. Whatever your father or mother had been, you had to be. And your children could be sold. If the state needed children in another area to populate them, they could simply take them and sell them. So you became a slave. The word serf, which is the basic component of the feudal system, is just a fancy word for slave. Now, Constantine is given this positive legacy because he took us from paganism to Christianity, which is seen for some reason as this beneficial religion. But if you look at the structure of authority in the feudal system, you'll see that, in fact, Christianity was just one of the edicts to set up the slave state, because at the top of the feudal system's hierarchy of authority, you didn't have Caesar, you had someone called the Pontiff Maximus, the Pope. But the Pontiff Maximus was just one of the designations that Caesars had. It just meant the head of the Roman College of Priests, and all of the Caesars from Julius forward were the Pontiff Maximus. So what you see, what has happened is the slave, the serf, will now not be able to rebel because there is a religious context for his slavery. And the person who's really directing him isn't Caesar, who could be an evil man, a vain or greedy person, but it's the Pontiff Maximus. But it's just Caesar by another name. He's just fooled people. It's just mind control. So then you go forward and you see how Christianity is being used today. And I would just say, look at the examples of how Christians are presented our foreign policy. For example, the wars in the Middle East. Very often they are believing and told that this is related to the book of Revelation's prophecies concerning how Jesus returns to the planet. The President Bush, when he was trying to gain France's cooperation in his coalition, he met with Chirac, and this was reported in a number of European newspapers, though for some reason didn't make it here into the US. And he told Chirac that he had to join the coalition because this was Gog and Magog. Now, Chirac nodded politely, and when Bush left, he turned to his aides and he said, "What was that?" They didn't know what he meant. They had to go get a Bible scholar who then reported to them that it appears that the American president believes that, or is claiming that the war that the book of Revelation describes is about to occur. So the effect of the religion is not beneficial here, is it? I mean, you have really zany principles that are being used as the basis for foreign policy, and the religion is still essentially just a form of mind control that makes it difficult for people to evaluate what is in their interests as opposed to what is in the interests of the state that is manipulating them.
I'd agree with all that for sure, Joe.
Yeah.
But I wanted to jump back to the Dead Sea Scrolls for a sec.
Sure.
And I was just wondering if you could kind of do some explaining as to Josephus in relation to Paul, in relation to a personage called the Liar in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right. Well, that's a theory that my colleague Robert Eisenman developed. And the Dead Sea Scrolls describes a struggle because the scrolls are cryptic. In other words, they don't give, except in a few cases, really specific designation for the individuals they're talking about. It's really hard to link them directly into history. There are a few points where they mention characters that are clearly historical, but when they talk about the spouter of lies and the wicked priest and the teacher of righteousness, they're using these terms which, you can't really link directly into our extant history. Bob Eisenman's theory is that the wicked priest seems very similar to the kind of role that the Apostle Paul plays. I think that he certainly is right in the logic. I think that before the Roman war occurred in 66 CE, there had been a long-standing attempt by Rome to essentially control the Jewish religion, to put authority into place that would tone it down, that would make it able to essentially exist inside the Roman Empire. And particularly the family of Herods, who were the Roman tax collector of the region, they had taken Maccabean wives. Now, the Maccabees they were the real Messianic family that had ruled Judea until Rome drove them out. and replace them with their puppets, the Herods. The people wouldn't accept the Herods as kings, and so to get around this stubbornness, the Herods took Maccabean brides, the idea being, since the religion saw the lineage coming through the female, that the offspring of these Maccabean brides that the Herods had could then be educated in Rome, brought back to Judea, and presented to the people. And they would say, look, here you go. Here's a legitimate Maccabean king, and you should just follow whatever he says. But the people wouldn't buy it. They understood they were being fooled. So the character Paul, as his relationship to the wicked priests in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think that the character Paul is in fact fictional. So he may have been based on someone that would essentially then could have been used as the basis for the wicked priest in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I don't have any evidence of that. I just think that the sort of the logic of this point in history, where you have Rome attempting to manipulate the Jewish religion to bring the Jews into control, enables you to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and to look at the character Paul and to see who's who and what's what. I mean, Paul, as he's presented, is basically a Roman agent. I mean, he's, for heaven's sakes, he's flatly saying, obey the magistrates. You know, it just tells you, obey the Roman magistrates. They were put there by God. I mean, this is the position of the Roman Empire. It's not the position of the Messianic movement that rebelled. And it's not the position of the xenophobic warriors described in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They would have killed Paul if they could get their hands on him. So you can see that it goes back to the principle of the dialectic. I mean, this just clarifies everything. Basically, it was a line in the sand, and you were either on the side of the Messianic rebels or you were on the side of Rome. And everyone who claims to be, representing the Jewish people who's on the Roman side of the ledger, I think is fake. I think Jesus and Paul obviously are, if they are not completely invented, are highly stylized by Roman writers to create a particular effect. Whereas when you look at the scrolls, what you see are hard-edged, xenophobic warriors that just want to drive the Romans out. So that's really how you can understand not just the history, but the religion that came out of the era. You can see that Christianity was a Roman invention. It didn't come from the Jews.
Well, Joe, wouldn't you say there was Jewish writers working for Rome?
Oh, sure. But they were on the payroll. They had abandoned their religion. The most famous Jewish intellectual family of the era was the family of Philo. Philo is just basically what is seen as the towering intellectual figure of Jewish writing in the first century. His brother was the Albarch of Alexandria, which is to say, the tax collector. They were the wealthiest family in the world. And when the Flavians decided to depose the Julio-Claudians, the family that Julius and Augustus had come from, and they would become the Caesars, the first family that stood for them, and this was literally taking their life into their hands, because if the Flavian rebellion failed, they would have died, were the Alexanders. In other words, the family of Philo, they said, and incidentally, this declaration there's copies of it still in existence. They stated that the Flavians were divine. So this shows you that they had completely abandoned the religion. They were into the money, and the money was with the Roman Caesar. It wasn't with some messianic character or the Jewish religion. They sided with the money, with the Flavian Caesars, but they were Jewish. And so when it comes to the writing of the Gospels, people wonder, well, how could these Roman Caesars has produced it? They had the most premier Jewish intellectuals of the era on the payroll. And these individuals made public statements, because Josephus did as well, that the Flavian Caesar was God. So the producing of the Gospels was virtually automatic.
Well, we've got the means, because that's one of the criticisms you get, Joe, is how did the Romans have the means to write this really complex Jewish literature? Well, we've got the Alexander family, and I explained the motivation before. It was to get the Messianic movement, Jews to, well, at least the moderate Jews to worship Caesar as God.
Right.
Joe, could you speak a minute to the idea of the blending of emotional belief into the hierarchy, pertaining to, for instance, the initial Flavians all being saints?
Oh, right. I
That
know.
it
It's
was
just,
within the.
yeah, it's just,
It's a glaringly obvious thing at first.
yeah, yeah, it's tragic. It's just absolutely tragic that this isn't more widely understood. I was just doing research yesterday into the patron saint of France is Saint Pedroncilla. I'm not pronouncing it right, but now she was seen as the daughter of Saint Peter's, right? This is the blending that you were referring to, where this individual somehow is blended into the history of the religion that we received. In her case, however, historical documents came out. Basically, someone had recorded the carvings on her tomb in the 16th century. And lo and behold, it turns out that the patron saint of France is not St. Peter's daughter, but rather she is the granddaughter of Vespasian Flavian. She is a member of the Flavian family, and she was buried in the catacomb of Flavia Domitilla, who's either Titus's granddaughter or actual daughter. And that individual is one of the very first Catholic saints, this Flavia Domitilla. She gave what is known as the oldest catacomb for Christian burial in existence as basically as a donation to the church. And there is an inscription from thanking her for creating this burial site. Now, if it was just these two, you might say, well, gee, it's just a strange circumstance. But then there is a little more of this blending that you're referring to, which is that all of the first Roman Catholic saints that we record are members of the Flavian family, or are part of their imperial household. And I mean Clement, Clemens, Neros, Aquila, they are all in one way or another members of the imperial family. And I always say, when you look at the Son of Man, I mean, it's not really that complicated. The Son of Man comes during the Roman War, and he does all this stuff, and all of these things are recorded as having occurred and were military victories of this guy Titus Flavius. Now, Titus Flavius claimed to be the Jewish Christ. So when you look at the first Catholic saints, you have to ask this one really simple question: who do you think they thought the Son of Man was? Do you think any of them would have missed the fact that the Christ that actually showed up and encircled Jerusalem with the wall and raised the temple was Uncle Titus? You see, none of them would have had this strange understanding of the Gospels that we do, which is that this character, Jesus Christ, is really the important individual, and that we don't know the identity of the Son of Man. The Son of Man, oh, who the heck could this be? Maybe Jesus is being metaphorical. Maybe he's talking about himself. I mean, all these different ways of looking at this. But the people who were the first Catholics that we know about, they knew who the Son of Man was. They knew it was Titus Flavius.
So now, is it the?
Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
Thanks. Is it the feudalism that has reinforced this and begun the installation of this belief system?
Well, I mean, yeah, feudalism certainly, remember, this is over 1,000 years. It ingrained our...
a threat.
What it did was that it conditioned us into believing in the story of Jesus as something that was plausible, and also to obeying the people who came representing him. And that's really, I think, unfortunate, because I think it's still with us today. I think when I look at the citizen, I just believe that we are pretty numb and are impotent in terms of sort of the behavior of the authorities. We don't speak up much when they do things which are not in our interest. I think today we have a situation where, I don't want to leak out my political perspectives, but I just feel that the oligarchs have a very, very powerful control over the media, over the financial system, and I don't see the population rebelling much. And I think that this impotence is to a large extent because the effects of the feudal system are still with us. We still pay attention to authority and simply go along when we're told to do things. And we go into the airports and we're supposed to be protected from unreasonable search and seizure. But there we are, all being scanned and groped, and yet, are we all suspects? Isn't this unreasonable that 100% of us would be terrorists? And yet we just put up with it. If there's anything that I hope comes from my work is that the citizen will be more skeptical of the motivation of authorities and will be more animated to do something about essentially being mind controlled into slavery.
This sort of begs the question. Is there a stream of leaders that have known since day one that this was a fraud? I think it was Pope Leo X has been quoted as saying, essentially, the myth of Christ has served us well. And that having been said, is it possible that there could be sort of an esoteric current and an exoteric current to the Christian movement?
Absolutely. It's just dangerous to even talk about. But yeah, I think that there is I think that in the book that I'm going to be bringing out in March, A Single Strand, I'm going to show how the knowledge of the typology is virtually a plaything of the oligarchs. They know about this. And they know that Christianity is just a very good control device of the masses. They also know now far more sophisticated and better ways to maintain their power. But Christianity is an old technique, but it's one that's been improved upon. And the leaders, a great many of them, do know about it.
So essentially what we, the unwashed masses, get are just the exoteric version. But if we could look at the esoteric version of Christianity, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think some type of Gnosticism has survived in an underground fashion?
Boy, I wish it had. I think that the underground Gnosticism that survived is your show. It's shows like this, the internet, and it's people like Ryan Gilmore who are able and willing to just discuss these things with the people and to give information. I mean, the internet has enabled us to communicate with one another. Citizen can communicate. We don't have to sit there and stare at the all-seeing eye and just listen to Walter Cronkite read us the version of history the oligarchs are interested in conditioning us into. We can exchange information for ourselves. We can develop techniques of both communication and analysis so that we can't be fooled, that we can't be lied to, and that we can create a political force that actually will actually represent our interests. So that's I don't know of any specific strain, but what I'm seeing is a lot of general strains, which are now a lot of them coming about because the internet has created the technology for the citizen to communicate, and we can communicate honestly with one another. You see, this is why shows like yours are just so important, because they really are the beginning of a real media for the citizens that the citizen has a chance to actually have some control over the information that goes into his mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think your theory is pretty solid, Joe. I also happen to think that there's a lot of other stuff that was meshed in with it. And when I say that, I guess I'm a pretty firm believer in the John Allegro theory of the mushroom cult. And I was just wondering what you thought of that.
Well, it's interesting. Like Jan Irwin actually was very interested in my work because of his connection with Allegro. Jan had become basically the in control of Allegro's literary estate. He works with Allegro's daughter, and Allegro had these very controversial ideas that the Christ was in some way related to psychedelic drugs, that there was some kind of connection. And he even, I think Allegro, and I don't want to misquote him, but basically he was saying that, the Messiah might be seen as the drug itself, And what when I talked to Jan, I pointed out to him that I had found a little typologic story inside of Josephus in which the Messiah is being described as a mandrake, and that this then is a drug that is given to the Messianic rebels to remove the demonic spirit of rebellion. And so it was quite an interesting linkage of concepts. So I'm, I would just, if you'd like to see my exact understanding of that, it's actually, I believe it's recorded in Caesar's Messiah, and happy to, at any time, discuss it with you privately. But I think that the little story in Josephus is not ambiguous at all. It simply states that the psychedelic drug was in some way connected with the concept of the Messiah.
Yeah, and I believe Allegro was quite a linguist, and he actually found a lot of double entendres and kind of hidden code words that, we in the West would never really come to terms with.
For sure, yeah, and that's, Allegro is literally my favorite Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, and
he was the loose cannon.
Yeah, he was the loose cannon. But it's like you say that you see. He, as you stated, he sees double ententes, and he supports them linguistically and with logic. But because they are ententes, they are not, the kind of straightforward declarative language that scholars like, because it's, there's no ambiguity. However, you cannot understand the Dead Sea Scrolls if you don't attempt to look at it with some symbolic understanding. And I just think Allegro, even if he was wrong, he's right, because he's the one person who's really trying to understand these strange expressions, to try to place the symbolic expressions, the coded expressions into history. And so, just my hat's off to Allegro. He was, I think he really had, the right approach to the literature.
And you read some of the original texts in Greek, is that correct, Joe?
Well, certainly the Gospels, the Dead Sea Scrolls are, Aramaic and Hebrew.
Essentially where I was going was just, did you find anything similar in your research when you looked at the Greek text?
In the Gospels?
Yeah.
I would give you an example of how the term Colossae is used by Josephus in regards to the individual that he describes captured on the Mount of Olives. Just like Jesus is captured on the Mount of Olives, Josephus describes someone that's captured on the Mount of Olives, and Titus takes this individual who is kind of suggested as a Messiah. They say he comes from a family of great dignity, in other words, a family like the Messianic lineage. And so they capture this guy on the Mount of Olives, and Titus says, I want him pruned. He uses the term Colossae. And now that term is actually a gardening term. It goes to the description of the pruning of plants. And this was how the Roman wit was being expressed. They were talking about the vegetative aspect of the Hebraic messianic prophecies, where you have the root of Jesse, the staff. These are expressions of the Messiah as a branch, you see, as something that grows out of a vegetative form. And this, of course, was part of the reasons that Allegro then, tried to go a step deeper and move it into a psychedelic plant as just not a regular one. But in any event, Titus orders them pruned. He uses this Greek word, which is often translated in Whiston translation of Josephus. They just use the expression death because they don't have any sort of rational way to plug pruned into what you would do to a captive. But if you look at this individual as being a typology of what's going to linked into the Gospels, you can then see that it makes perfect sense that they were going to take this individual and prune him like a plant and graft on a Roman, Messianic individual. This is the, why Paul talks about how the branches were grafted in. And he's simply, describing symbolically what the Romans attempted to do. They attempted to take the Jewish tree, Messianic tree that is being symbolically represented in their prophecies, and graft on a Roman branch who would then become the Messiah and rule the Jews.
Joe, you have mentioned in other interviews that you feel like they wanted this information to be discovered, that when the Romans put it in there, that there was almost an arrogance to it. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, they wanted, obviously, to be recorded as having done this event. What was important to the Caesars was legacy, and I would actually think Ryan, because of a particular study he's done on the psychopath, could probably do a better job than I would, but hopefully he'll speak after this. But I just think they're crazy. And I think that vanity ruled them to such an extent that all they cared about was immortal legacy. I mean, I guess after you've been Caesar for a decade and you've raped everybody and you've killed thousands and thousands of people, I mean, you get bored. What do? So you fantasize about how the future will look about you. And so this is what I think was really driving them because they didn't need to put the typology to show that they were the Son of Man. This was irrelevant. They didn't need to do that. They could have created a character of Jesus Christ and just had him be a lovable, peaceful person, and that would have been that. But they went to all this bother to put the typology in just because of vanity, which I think is related to mental condition. What do you think, Ryan? Do you think that there's anything in their mental condition that brought this about?
Well, yeah, I think it could be psychopathy, but also I think it does relate to what we were talking about before of one message for the classes and one for the masses. So it's playing this game and riding this fine line of they did want to communicate something to the ruling class, but for everyone else, they wanted the message hidden. So yeah, they had to play this game of revealing and hiding at the same time, and their vanity turned it into a high art of using poetry and metaphor, but actually, it's not your regular allegory. It's more like it's literature with a key, and I think what Joe's discovered is some of the keys where it's not like an allegory where it can inspire different meanings to different people. At the heart of it, and this is what I've gotten from Joe's work, is once you discover the cipher or the key, there is actually one solution to some of the puzzles in the literature. And I think the ruling class, like Joe says, maybe because they were bored and a bit mad, is they enjoyed creating these puzzles. It was a way for them to continue their feeling of superiority because they knew the keys and they were very proud of the complex puzzles they created. And I think
wait. Do you see any examples of this in present day politicians and leaders?
You're asking me, Joe?
Yes.
I would say.
Well, we see it in serial killers. I mean, they taunt the police, right? And they send them clues and letters and
what about politicians? Ryan, do you see any politicians or leaders that you could think would fall into this class of individual?
Well, are you talking about creating this kind of complex literature?
No, I'm talking
Or
about
just with that mindset of the psychopath?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, sure. Now, I don't think we can know with certainty whether some of the Caesars were psychopaths. We just have our suspicions. But yeah, I think the ruling class today is very much psychopaths do make it to the top because of having no conscience and being completely ruthless. And yeah, and it's like, yeah, go ahead.
How do we protect ourselves from such an individual? How do we recognize them, and then how do we protect ourselves?
Well, first step is recognizing the sort of profile of the psychopath, that unlike the serial killers we know about or the way they're portrayed in Hollywood films, psychopaths are not usually out of control and crazy. They're actually often quite charming, and they don't tend to commit murder personally because it just leads to too much trouble. I mean, what they are really interested in is, and it's hard not to go into sort of a religious language here or metaphysical language, but they sort of feed on the souls of others. They lack something that regular people have, and it's a kind of parasite-host relationship where they act as sort of consciousness parasites that they need us to sort of live off of. And so there is this relationship there. And to do that, they have to use all sorts of deception to convince us to act in ways that are against our interests. So the defense against that is first, learning what the psychopath is, and that there are a lot of psychopaths in high positions in politics, media, etc. And then learn that they have created false worlds, false histories, false ideas, and convince us that these are the truth. So that's another step, is starting to deconstruct those. And as soon as we see that some of these are false, we start to sort of shed light into those shadows, and some of the parasitic relationship starts to break down as soon as we start shedding light. So I'd say that's just in general the first steps we have to take.
So can I ask you two a question? Are you guys atheist materialists, or do you think there could be a spiritual component to all this?
I'd say neither Joe or I are atheists. Go ahead, Joe.
No, and I'm not rich enough to be a materialist either. I mean, I would be if I could, but when you have a mortgage and you're paying interest to the Federal Reserve, it's hard to be a materialist. You tend to be more of a spiritualist, I suppose. But I think that the more subtle religious questions, the ones that are in our interior world, obviously are perhaps the most important part of our consciousness. But we have at the moment, this issue that the citizen doesn't have the information that they need to defend themselves against psychopaths. And so just from my own perspective and in my own work, I try to address that subject specifically. I mean, I really feel that like Caesar's Messiah, I would hope is something that people can use as a way to become more skeptical about the intentions of leaders. And I would hope that, and particularly it's encouraging to see shows like this, that are starting to come into existence, that there'll be a general increased level of scrutiny from the citizens, development of technique. And that's why I was interested in Ryan's comment about, how there are times when the ability for the psychopath to lie effectively breaks down. I think that should be really well understood. That should be studied and developed and given to children. And we should have political education that we take out of the hands of government, because obviously this isn't going to work. And when they go into the public school social studies classes, what they get. So the citizen needs to learn these techniques, learn how the psychopath has developed skills to rule us, and then basically give what we learn into a dynamic form, give it to our children, give it to one another, and to use information to create a community. Because one of the things that we have right now is we don't have any community because it's all been shattered and taken apart because it's so easy to control us when we all live in our little apartments, and we, the only thing we know about our neighbors is their guard dogs. So this is, what I hope is that there will be, through all of these efforts, just a coalescence. There'll be more and more communion, more and more camaraderie, more exchange of information. We have to sort of relearn to trust and love one another again. I mean, I look at, you look at things like Miley Cyrus. Here is, this young girl who is the role model for preteens. And then she morphs overnight into the most degenerate, sort of abuser of sexual, attitude imaginable. And you have to ask yourself, is this circumstance, right? Could this possibly have happened where the premier role model for the preteens overnight becomes this just almost bestial sexual being that is now, taking all of the trust that has been given to her as this preteen role model and is now then essentially helping young girls become prostitutes and sex slaves?
Oh, I don't believe in coincidences, Joe.
Yes, I don't either. I don't believe it either. And so that's why
Miley Cyrus wasn't the first sort of teen idol that this has been done to, so that does make it very suspicious.
No, it's a pattern that they do with all of them. I guess where I wanted to go with it, I was wondering what you guys thought of the theory of the Archons.
Well, I think it's if you're referring to sort of the Gnostic view of the Archons, I think it's a mythical story, but it is quite satisfying. I couldn't speak to whether it being true or false, but it's I think the Gnostic sort of cynical view of our world and of who the Archons are. It's certainly a theology that at least in a mythical way explains or tries to explain what's wrong with our world. Again, I can't. I don't feel I know whether it's literally accurate to what's happening, but I certainly feel it's a good symbolic story that explains the suffering in the world, and certainly the mainstream Christian view just doesn't of a merciful, passionate God, and that's the only explanation for what's sort of going on spiritually in the world, isn't a very satisfying explanation. So at least the Gnostics have something that's a little more explanatory.
Yeah, it's good vocabulary. I mean, I don't have any, I have no understanding of what the word, comes from. I mean, I don't know these individuals, but I know it's a good way to look at the oligarchs. I use the word oligarchs just because it doesn't have, it isn't connected into such, a mist of, beliefs and understandings. I think that, I mean, and maybe it's just because I'm simple-minded, but I just look, going back to the dialectic, I just look at the oligarchs and the people. And Archons and whatever, if you're, if you're controlling the money and the media, you are opposed to the people. And so how we are able to exchange ideas that are beneficial to us, how we can organize ourselves, whatever vocabulary works is fine with me. And if we want to replace oligarchs with Archons, God bless you. But we just have to always bear in mind that what we're trying to do is to animate and to educate the people, those that are across the line from the oligarchs. What we need to do really is to identify the oligarchs. And one thing I've been saying a number of times. I was interviewed on a Russian network last month, and I said, look, first of all, the Christianity is just another version of Marxism. I mean, it's a paradise that is being sold to the working class, but by people who don't even believe in the theory to begin with. I mean, this is what I said about Marxism. I said the people who created it, the people who brought it to you, all they wanted was political power. like Christianity. The paradise is just a narration. So this would be how I would deal with the question of the Archon. We should have genetic testing of all of our leaders, right? I want to see if they're a family. I want to see if there is a relationship between, Merkel and Putin and Clinton and people like this. Now, I could be wrong, and there could be no relation, but if democracy is going to be healthy, we need to know this, because we really need to know. We have to be absolutely certain that the ruling class doesn't have some kind of hidden connection that is not disclosed, because if they do, then basically we're just slaves, right? If democracy is just a sham and all the leaders that we're being told we can choose from are all related. So this can be done. It's not very expensive. We can even do it without their permission, because I'm sure a lot of their relatives or hopefully would participate in it. And we could build a little genetic database for the citizen. Wouldn't that be nice? So that we could then, when some new comet comes up through the media, like Obama, we could just check and make sure, you have this dark face, but your, mother's family. Let's look into this and see who they're related to. And this, is a paranoid concept, but, democracy is a serious business. And we deserve, given the fact that in the 20th century, we were holocausted, right? I mean, the 20th century was just it's really, if you want to do something really fun, you're bored one afternoon, go and try to find how many Europeans were slaughtered during the 20th century. The Jews look at the Holocaust, and very rightly, and obviously correctly, and I would hold the same position if I was in their position, that what happened in World War II was a Holocaust. But there's a more general problem, which is that there's another somewhere between 150 and 250 million people that were killed by murder, wars, all these things. This we don't want to repeat, right? I mean, everyone wants to avoid that. We want to avoid the Jewish Holocaust, and we want to avoid the European Holocaust that came about through bad governance. So democracy is a very serious thing, and it failed just catastrophically in the 20th century. We would really like not to repeat this. So the first step in my mind is, and it's in this vein coming through the idea of the Archon, is look, let's just see who the heck these people are, right? Let's just make sure that they're not just one big happy family laughing at us as we, obey them and go off to war to do, their whatever amuses them in terms of foreign policy.
Joe, I have to agree with you on that. And I had read somewhere that a lot of the U.S. presidents go back to being related to Queen Elizabeth, for example.
Isn't it a shock?
And even when presented with that kind of information, and Ryan, I'd love for you to speak to this as well, that there's like this cognitive dissonance, and people are not willing to truly examine their belief systems or the suspicions they have, and like they really don't think that we have a ruling class.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of Americans who don't think they're in a classless society, and there was a film that was. It was the first documentary musical called The American Ruling Class, and they brought up that question in the film. It was sort of a story about a sort of a young man going through an Ivy League college, and he's sort of saying, "There isn't an American ruling class, is there?" And the film basically tells you, "Oh, yes, there is. I mean, you can be invited into it, but." I don't know if you can be invited to the top, but you can sort of be invited into the middle if you're wealthy enough. But yeah, it certainly shows it looks like another one of those false histories that, for example, the meme that anyone can be president. I think that's clearly not true. Clearly not true.
Right. And do we ever really see the top of the ruling class, or are they unseen and unnamed?
Well, I think why Constantine chose Christianity, because when it first kicked off, Joe and I don't believe that it was pegged to be the state religion. It was Constantine quite a while later that decided, after examining the effect Christianity had on the citizens of the empire, that there's going to be one state religion. We're going to unify the entire empire, and that's the religion we're going to choose. And I think why it was chosen, partly it did make us sort of a docile citizen, but also before that, sort of coming from the Egyptian pharaoh system, where you had a visible sort of state leader who was seen as a god, but that could always be a political target. But as soon as you took someone mystical and deceased like Jesus Christ, who was in heaven, you couldn't have any political opposition to someone who's deceased. That was a good way for the Caesar to hide behind a mythical figure, and so I think since then, the top of the ruling class has been very hidden since then, and yeah, it's pretty tough to really discover who is at the top, because since that period, it's been behind the scenes, and they decided, this is working really well. Actually, that was the problem before, was we had the head of state completely, the head of power completely in the forefront and worshipped as a god. But let's put them in the background, because that's actually a lot more effective. And so it's pretty tough to find out who really is at the top.
Where do you think the Vatican plays into all of this?
I think that the Vatican is, at this point, simply a tool. I think that they do control the College of Cardinals, and that just as Ryan was suggesting, that the Pope is just a mask for the oligarchs that control it. I mean, if you look at the Vatican Bank and who controls it, I mean, these people are just absolutely and thoroughly involved with the central banking cartel that rules Europe and the United States. So I don't really think the Vatican is anything special at this point. I just think it's another tool of the oligarchs, and it has a certain mind control power that not as great as the one that their electronic media does, but it's able to keep a few peasants quiet, so they continue to go forward with it. But I think it's just a tool at this point.
Well, I think since I've started studying Joe's work, I sort of see the story of Western history, at least of this age, or if an age lasts around 2,000 years, is this battle between Rome and Judea, and that there has been this sort of Roman elite and Jewish elite still competing. So there is this Jewish elite element as well that have also risen up over the centuries in areas of banking, and then more modern area of in media. And so I think the rest of us are still caught in this battle. I mean, these messianic dreams that come out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I don't think they ever died. They sort of went underground. And yeah, so those Jewish messianic dreams and sort of xenophobia and militarism. I mean, to me, it's hard not to connect them to the continued battles in the Middle East. I mean, it's in the same area of the world, and for me, it's hard to not see a connection to the Dead Sea Scrolls today.
Yeah, that sort of brings me to a point I wanted to ask you, gentlemen. What do you think that Christianity now has essentially outlived its usefulness for the elites? Or do you think that, again, it's just, one faction, say the Zionist faction, trying to destroy the Christian faction? Because it seems like the trend right now is to do away with Christianity.
It's a very interesting question. I don't know. I think that there are still a lot of poor, uneducated people in the world, and so Christian missionaries still may have some um, value for oligarchs in those areas. I mean, they would want to reuse the things that worked so well in the past.
I would say no. I would say no, because I think as long as it is working, they'll keep it.
Yeah, I don't think there's any reason for that. There's no reason to get rid of it at this point. It's still working to some extent, so they would continue to benefit from it. I think that they're obviously developing replacements for it, or different kinds of techniques. I mean, when you look at how sophisticated mind control has been, I mean, I'm sure all of you are familiar with that project the CIA ran, MK Ultra. If you look at the theoretical applications that they were attempting to develop, you can really see that there is certainly the desire to have really, really sophisticated mind control techniques. There's a really interesting thing. There's a thing called A Course in Miracles. I don't know if you ever heard of it, but it's a book that was really the progenitor of the neo-Christianity. In other words, this book described someone who could channel Jesus. And so you could get his current take on foreign affairs and, whatever they wanted to comment on. And that book, A Course in Miracles, even though it's not that well known, it was really the seminal book that began the neo-Christianity with the channeling and the kind of modern Jesus. Marianne Williamson and Oprah both were advocates of it and supported it. Well, it's fascinating that the authors of that book at the time they were creating it, Thetford and Schumann, that they were very sophisticated psychologists, and they were studying basically crowd control, and they were part of MK Ultra. I mean, I don't have specific information about their employment of what they were actually doing, but all of those dots are in fact correct, that at the time that they put out the Neo-Christianity Course in Miracles, they were employees of this CIA operation that was trying to learn how to control crowds. So I think Christianity is sublimated. It's been, it's not the front burner mind control device, but they're still going to use it for a while.
Yeah, they may use the Hegelian dialectic to come up with some new synthesis. I think, not to go too far down the conspiratorial trail, but I think Albert Pike was quoted as saying that they want to do at some point indoctrinate people into the Luciferian type religion or something to that effect.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole Lucifer thing is sort of not been well understood. Most of that stuff comes from the Book of Revelation, and what occurs in the Book of Revelation is at the end of it, they have a character called the Lightbringer, and the word is actually the basis for the word Lucifer. And he appears, and then you have the New Jerusalem, and everybody is happy, and there's this, the end of the age, basically. The New World Order is how the Book of Revelation actually describes it, the New Order. So when I think when people talking about the devil in this, basically what I think is it's just this humor of the oligarchs, that really what they are doing is they're very familiar with the Book of Revelation and all these prophecies, and just like the Romans had their sense of humor about how the events of the Roman war had been prophesized by the group that they were essentially oppressing. I think that in our current age, the oligarchs look at events that are occurring, and it amuses them to think that they were prophesized, right?
Yeah, so, I agree with you. I think they're actually making these prophecies come true.
Exactly, just like the Romans did, so they do it. And so that's what we're dealing with now. And that's why I always, I tell people, pay attention to the relationship to the the book of Revelation, because the oligarchs seem to focus on that book. They seem to really enjoy bringing these things about, and so the citizen needs to be aware of their sense of humor if we don't want to be the butt of the joke, particularly since the book of Revelation talks about the apocalypse, which means massive population reduction.
I think it's safe to say all prophecies since the Old Testament were made to happen, or attempts to make to happen, or at least that's the purpose of these prophecies. There's always political motive behind them. I mean, look at the Old Testament. It's about it's a land grab. It's saying to the locals that, well, God told us this is your land, and since then it's been political motivation behind prophecies, and it just the Romans tried to take that over and say, no, we're going to play that game now and say, oh no, the God's gone on our side now.
Right. That's exactly right. I mean, basically, it's always about power, money, finance, and land. And you just try to put a religious context to it to bamboozle the populations that you're trying to accept being enslaved or driven out or exterminated or whatever. So this is unfortunately the truth about how religion has been a component of Western civilization for the last 2,000 years. It's just a tool of the oligarchs, and it's just in place to bamboozle the slave populations.
Yeah,
I think
sorry, carry on.
Oh, I think the latest attempt at this, at least in my opinion, it was the 2012 meme, which now that we've gone through it, and I myself got a little bit sucked into that. Could this be possible? Things sort of seem to be speeding up, but changes seem to be going faster. Maybe we are going to something in 2012 or some singularity, as some sci-fi writers talk about it, some big change happening. And so now that's come and gone, and looking back on it, and now that I've got familiar with Joe's work, I do see some of the same techniques, the prophesizing something happening in the future, getting people to anticipate things that are going to happen, and how that can basically stop political action or any opposition, because especially with the 2012 meme, depends on sort of which part of it you were following. There was sort of one side, sort of a more new agey side to it, that was we don't have to do anything. Everything's a savior is going to come not in a person, but just with this year coming, and we're going to have some sort of spiritual paradise in 2012. And looking at it from the Caesar's Messiah perspective, it's a way of sort of quelling rebellion or quelling political opposition or distraction. It gets people not to sort of keep their eye on the ball. It gets them going down other rabbit holes. And the other side of the 2012 meme was it was going to be the end of the world and sort of disaster films, and so it puts you in a fear state as well. So I think it's similar games of playing this prophecy game. I think I'll after reading Joe's work, I won't look at these things the same way again. So hopefully that's maybe our message here. It does take away the power from some of these things, and we can look back at the history and just saying, this is just made up stuff. That's you get the public to believe that someone has this power of prophecy, and once they have that, once they convince you that, they can really suck you into their world, and then the manipulation really starts at that point.
It's almost like a self-reinforcing negative feedback loop, because people will say, oh well, Israel was created in 1948, so then all these people sort of want to push for the next crazy thing to happen, right?
Well, sure, because they're waiting for Jesus to return. Like if you're talking about the Christian Zionists, and I mean, they, in my mind, I think they have been manipulated by the Jewish elite, people in Israel who want them to support their cause. And so this Christian Zionist movement has really picked up speed in the United States, and a lot of it is just pointing back to the Old Testament, telling to Christians, "Oh, look back in the Old Testament. It says this is all meant to come to pass," and even convincing them, well, if you support us politically with the Mideast wars, actually you're going to get Jesus to come back. So help us out with that.
Yeah, everybody makes a living off of stupidity, and you have Christian evangelicals who give this stuff to their congregations because this is what they want to hear. They don't want to hear, you have to think clearly. They want to hear this metaphysical, kind of prophetic stuff, and so they're very vulnerable to it. And the evangelical preacher gets tremendous benefit from these bizarre theories of Zionism, which link into the Book of Revelation. I mean, anyone who looks at the Book of Revelation and somehow thinks that this is going to end up good for Israel is just insane. I mean, look at the book. It talks about all these, bombs and destruction, all this weird stuff. So it's just, whatever you can sell to the sheep to, make your ends meet, they do. That's why the real solution is just to learn to think clearly, to reconnect to your senses. When I look at the media, I think the media is simply a function of the oligarchs at this point. All it does is produces sexual degeneracy, which is obviously makes people easier to control because you have no family production, and terror. I mean, look at the shows. I mean, they're always apocalyptic, these post-apocalyptic shows that they're all about people eating flesh and shooting one another. I mean, it just, how do you go from watching like 8 hours of The Walking Dead to thinking clearly about, who you should elect for your council person in your local election? Your mind is shot. And so that's what the purpose of them is. And that's why I would also say another, paranoid position is that you look at all these shows that we have now that are about, kind of surviving in the wilderness, right? There's just hundreds of them and hundreds of shows that celebrate extremely intellectually dim, primitive groups like Duck Dynasty, right? These shows are just epidemic now. Dual Survivor, Man and Wife Survival, Naked Survivor, Terrorized Survivor, Duck Dynasty. Where does that all take us? Where do all these shows take us culturally? It seems to me that they just prepare us for a post-technologic world, right? A world without electricity.
It certainly does. It does seem like all these programs just popped up in the past, 5 or 6 years. Like
exactly.
You want to say out of the blue, but it wasn't out of the blue. It's probably out of Tavistock or wherever, right?
That's what I would say. I think this is what the citizen has to be afraid of. This is why, I just don't think you can have too much paranoid energy. You need all of it, because you need all that energy in order to think clearly, in order to do the research, and then to act politically, then to take, say, look, I can organize these 4 people that I know who share this idea to some extent into a group that acts politically, that tries then to influence more people, and then eventually has some kind of political power whereby you influence the very smallest local politicians around you. This is what we have to do. It has to be this grassroots, one elected official at a time approach, where we try to reestablish a political system in Europe and the United States that represents the people.
And to that, Joe and Ryan, when I'm out interacting in public and people are, gosh, they're so buying into the left-right paradigm or the junk food culture or the cable culture, the propaganda arm of the government. How do you even start having those kind of conversations when they won't even examine past the given parameters?
I guess because of the internet, we are going to have a very polarized culture, and I don't think there's a way to avoid that. I think this is just a stage we're going to have to go through. And I mean, I'm so happy we're connecting. I'm in London,
Yes.
by the way, so we're connecting across the world, and it is this growing subculture. It's, I guess you have to start small with people, and you have to sort of test the waters, dip your toe in the waters, and seeing if you can get them to see a few little things, because it's pretty ego bruising to dump a lot of this stuff on the uninitiated, and I guess people have to be willing to leave the fantasy world. There has to be something on sort of the average person's end that makes them want to see through the fantasy and the propaganda and the lies. Well, unfortunately, the only thing I see is, I guess the crisis is going to have to get worse, because the fact is, crisis and suffering, that is the great motivator in anyone's life. And so the only realistic thing I can see is, as people notice the problems getting worse, that is going to open them up to or it's going to motivate them to leave the fantasy world that they're in. I don't know.
I agree very much.
Yeah.
I think that when people emerge from this painful experience is when people like us have a certain responsibility to slowly divulge ideas to them that they can, grow into bigger things, and then this emotional intelligence can flourish, as well as a basis in some actual knowledge, rather than this, program of lies that we've come so accustomed to.
Can I ask everyone in the roundtable how they got into these topics and what started them on that path?
For me, it was, as I've pretty much just said, through a crisis, a painful experience, and then
Right.
Emerging into the truth. But at the same time, throughout youth, there was always something that seemed a little off. It
Right.
took the precipice to get me to actually look.
Yeah,
And I think it's a I think a pattern that I've seen in many folks that are going down this road.
Yeah, for me, it was just the when the internet came out in the 90s or whatever, I just started, going down all these rabbit holes. And I didn't, I wouldn't say it fully woke me up, but then when 9/11 happened, it was like,
Yeah.
man, that was it.
I think 9/11 was a huge mistake.
I agree. It backfired on them.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, when I was a little girl, even as young as 8 years old, having a bit of paranormal experiences that didn't fit into the logical explanations that I was given by the adults around me. And so those continued throughout my life. And then, of course, with 9/11, when I started examining that further and I was willing to go down that rabbit hole, it opened up a whole lot of questions that were never satisfied.
Yeah, it was 9/11 for me as well. But it took me probably 2004, a few years later, because when it happened, I had no clue. But just things coming out on the internet, it really opened up a lot of things for me, and I think it's happened to a lot of people.
And on that note, what I find with people as well is when they open that door to examine their beliefs or to even articulate their suspicions, it seems that if they can get their arms or mind around that perhaps our government did perpetuate any of this kind of stuff, religion is the last thing they're willing to let go of, because you're dealing with people's salvation or how they think of heaven or hell or loved ones that have passed. And I think religion is the last thing they're willing to let go of, or not willing to let go of, or to examine. Do you find that as well?
Yeah, I do. And I get, you can imagine some of my public appearances, I get quite a few people who have strong opposition based on that they don't want to give up, the religious concepts that they've been trained in. So that's one of the stumbling blocks that we have to get people to think clearly. And the other, of course, is that there is just a relentless training in being mind controlled that goes on, outside of religion, that goes on through the things that we were talking about, the TV shows, the newspapers, and just the general way history is being taught to children. So how do we make it better? Well, first of all, we continue the activities that we're doing, because this is how we communicate with one another, and hopefully we get these ideas into a larger population. And then we constantly try just to refine our ability to think clearly. We just want to have as much energy and clarity as we possibly can when we approach every single day. There isn't a minute to waste. And so we want to know when we're being mind controlled. I mean, this to me is like one of the first steps, is just to put the idea to people that you're just living in a Alice in Wonderland, kind of artificial creation. And the only way out is through your ability to think clearly. So that's why you want to suspect when events are being given to you in a certain political context, that there's some motivation in back of it. That's really the first step, is just to say, look, you have to start thinking about motivation. You have to start thinking about what is in back of the people who are bringing you this concept. They're inserting something into your mind. Do they have a motivation other than just the recording of history or the presentation of an interesting story? You have to have that thought. Is there motivation? What are they trying to do with this stuff? So that's the first step. And I think that, as Ryan was saying, that people's minds become more open the hungrier they get. And as I see the economy, I think it's just the situation we're in is just going to get worse and worse. So I think that more and more people are going to be open-minded going forward. So
that's the silver lining. It's not going to be pleasant to go through, but without that crisis, it's hard for most people to just be open to these ideas.
Right. And this time when there's a crisis, Rahm Emanuel says, you never waste a crisis. Well, thanks for the tip. I think that this time we should be prepared to take advantage of the crisis. Those of us in the internet community that are trying to get these ideas out, that to give a lot of people as the idea that there is something in back of the crisis other than just random unfolding of history, to have them start again to go to the idea of motivation. Was there something about this event, for example, like the financial crisis of 2008 that is still going on? Is there anything about this that is suspicious? Is there anything about this that could be used against me? These are the just simple concepts that we need to have people start to ask.
I like to ask this question of people that are aware and peeling back the layers of these type of things. Is there anything in our reality that you consider that is not contrived or manipulated for control? Have you found anything yet?
No.
Now, are you talking about a certain field?
I'm talking about anything.
Okay.
It could be nature, it could be anything.
Yeah, I mean, since 2004, I guess the last 10 years now, I'm sure like you folks, I've been looking into all sorts of subjects. I've looked into medicine, education,
Yes.
Media, and what I've found, religion, and I do find a lot of false concepts, false ideas. So I think these big institutions and areas of society, I'd say there's always some level of control. That doesn't mean everything in it is false, but there's always an attempt to control that field for sure.
Okay, because
the Super Bowl.
Yeah,
sports, sure.
Yeah, the Super Bowl. You have this military worship, right? You start the thing off with jet planes flying all over the place, and they bring in like 50 wounded veterans, and then you have a 3,000-foot flag with all these soldiers and stuff, and you just have this military worship that goes on for about 45 minutes, and then the commercials now have returning from war soldiers constantly, being shown. So they are, this doesn't mean that they had the center snap the ball and hit Peyton Manning in the head in the first play of the game, but it means that just in general, they use everything. Anything that's, if it's in the media, right, you can pretty much be certain that the oligarchs are considering how to use it for their betterment. I think that they're very relentless. And so if it's something that we're aware of, generally is something that's in the media, religion, the political parties, athletics, certainly the celebrities, I think, yeah, that stuff is all manipulated. That's why, going back to Miley Cyrus, I just don't see any chance whatsoever that that's circumstantial. I think she's, was somehow controlled into a very destructive posture by people that wanted to have just another ratcheting down of the culture, because basically it just makes them easier to control. So it doesn't mean that they write her songs, everyone, but it certainly means that in general there's shaping, there's posture, there's concept. They're using all this stuff against us in a general sense.
But
Yeah,
I think
would agree.
I think there's things that slip through on the mainstream media. I mean, for example, thanks to the wonders of YouTube now, it's quite amazing looking into the energy issue, how people have collected so many sort of local news affiliates on the major networks like ABC, NBC, etc. All these free energy inventions that are announced. I mean, we got stuff from the 80s and 90s that have shown up on YouTube now, and it's like someone invents a water-powered car, for example, and the local news affiliate reporter says, expect to see this in a few years. It's going to change. Imagine paying almost nothing at the gas station or something, and then you never hear of it again. But now this is sort of being resurrected off of VHS tapes people have digitized that they accidentally recorded, for example, and it does show, because now we have this video archived through YouTube and other sites, that things do slip through the mainstream media now and again, but they do get buried. There's usually, I assume, some editor at a higher position that will try and quash these stories from having legs.
Yeah, but the solution is to essentially replace the mainstream media with the people's media, with free media.
We're sidestepping that already now.
Right. I mean, that's why this kind of show is in and of itself the right process to go into, to try to change the world to one in which the people have an actual some political power. The information that we can exchange is the power. And so we just have to have, your show, and I'm sorry to say you're now going to have to go 24 hours a day, because
always have a breaking alert, right?
I hope you have some throat lozenges, because you're going to be talking a lot here. Look, this is really what we have to do. We just have to bring this information into a wider understanding, and we have the tools to do it. We have no excuse at this point. With the internet, we actually have a tool that we can reach out. I've actually thought that we need to create much more cooperation, so that all of the shows like yours can be organized into a media that has ways of collecting information, ways of doing news reporting, ways of exchange of information when something important has been discovered. I mean, this is what we have to do, is we have to build a media that replaces the one that the oligarchs have.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that. And to that degree, it will backfire on the control structure.
Sure.
How do you guys feel about sort of anti-piracy laws coming in that appear to be ways to gain control of the internet?
I think they're doomed to fail. It seems like every time they try and ratchet down the police state, somebody finds a way around it.
Yeah, it's pretty tough. It's pretty tough
And
to
with
kill it.
and with like decentralization, and it just seems like technology is really working against them.
I mean, I could
think-
see. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think truth finds a way. In whatever shape or form it happens, it finds a way. And the internet is the expression that we have right now. And too many people are going to be drawn to it like moth to a flame. It's just a universal truth in and of itself is the way I see it.
Yeah, I had an experience just a while ago with a friend of one of my daughters who is a big data programmer for a famous US corporation. And I said, isn't this a problem, because you're essentially providing a kind of precognition capacity for the oligarchs. And he said, yeah, he says, we're well aware of that, those of us who are doing the coding and creating these devices. And he said, you'd better be sure of one thing, that we are going to be able to look at them as closely as they look at us. Whenever they collect data upon us, those of us who are writing this code know ways that we can watch them do that and understand what they are collecting and why they are collecting, who they're focused on. They hack us, well, frankly, we can hack back. So I think that this is really a positive position, that the idea that the internet is something that is a one-way information forum for the NSA, that's something that people who have brain power and have technical skills can resist, and they will be supported by the public in their efforts. So we really have an opportunity here with the information that can be given out, and with the technology that real patriots and real citizens can gain control over. We can start to make a difference politically.
Well, Joe and Ryan, we really appreciate people like you putting your information out and willing to come on to our shows and discuss this type of information. And that's the key for us, is having guests like you that are willing to waken the 100th monkey, if you will.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, it's our pleasure.
And we would love to have you back to talk about what you have in the pipeline. And Joe and Ryan, if you could let our listeners know where they can find out more about you and where to get your books and your information.
Well, Caesar's Messiah, go to caesarsmessiah.com. You can get books and information. Ryan, you want to talk about the Covert Messiah?
Yeah, I've got the event page from the conference still up, covertmessiah.com. Joe and I are trying to get a radio show off the ground here, so that's going to be at iotaradio.com. So that's coming soon.
And
That's fantastic.
We'll have other venues that hopefully we'll be able to announce pretty quick. I mean, the Covert Messiah was quite a success in terms of its media impact, and we're going to try to leverage that into perhaps some internet events that will be able to be available for everyone, not just people who are in London. So we're going to try that, and hopefully we can be on your show again. And in the meantime, I just want to say, you just have 100% of my support, and if there's ever anything I can do to help you guys, just let me know.
Thank you so much. And we would love to have you back. You're always welcome. And we've appreciated all the information today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.